You're listening to Guardians of Galen, your go-to podcast for USC Trojan basketball.
Let's get started.
Welcome back to Guardians of Galen, your favorite podcast on USC basketball. As always, I'm your host, Casey Kasliner, as the Trojans head to Chicago, but fall narrowly to the Northwestern Wildcats. Final score 77-75, a heartbreaking loss for USC. A game they, faced adversity going into, lose by 2, obviously trailed by as many as 15 points in the second half, but had a very convincing comeback attempt, even tied the game up late, but with 2 seconds left, Nick Martinelli gets the game-winning layup in what was an absolutely incredible game for the surefire NBA prospect. He dropped 27 points and got 10 rebounds as well, and shot 11 of 25 from the field. So the Trojans are not able to contain a star, something we've seen this season where, when they play teams like Michigan State that don't necessarily have that 1A player, they can handle that. But of course, against a team like Northwestern, a very top-heavy team, they were unable to get the job done. Of course, mentioned this last episode, but Brooks Barnhizer, their second leading scorer, a guy who contributes 17 points per game, was deemed out for the season, and I thought that was going to be a big note coming into this game, especially considering that Northwestern has struggled a lot this season. Obviously, they're a team with Nick Martinelli, who's, a dynamic player, but they've lost plenty of games recently, plenty of close games as well. Came into the USC game on a 3-game losing streak, but they snapped that at home, and a tough one for the Trojans, and one that, for USC, they'd like to have back, especially considering just some of the mistakes in this game that went down. USC was heavily out-rebounded in this game, 43-27, and we've talked about this all season. USC is a team that really struggles to get rebounds, but I'm looking on the offensive glass. USC was out-rebounded 23-7, and so that's something to note. USC actually shot pretty efficiently in this game from 3 as well. They shot 51% from the field and 50% from beyond the arc with 9 makes. And so not bad, honestly. And obviously we circle back and we look at those 3-point makes to Clark Slajchert. He was 4 for 4 from beyond the arc. He gets his first start as a USC Trojan. And the Trojans had their 9th starting lineup of the year. Obviously we've talked about Eric Musselman and what he's been able to do with this lineup and shift things around. Of course, when you have a first-year team like this, you have to make changes, but it was the pretty typical starting lineup, but slotting in Clark Slajchert for Desmond Claude, who, of course, only missed 5 minutes with an injury against Michigan State, but they ruled him out of this game. And honestly, Clark Slajchert filled those shoes of Desmond Claude very nicely. He scored 24 points, which was, of course, his USC career high, 9 of 11 from the field. Of course, like I mentioned, a perfect 4 for 4 from distance. So he was the leading scorer for USC. Filled in really nicely. And I mentioned this last episode, but I feel like when Wesley Yates, Desmond Claude, and Chibuzo Abo, those 3 guards, really get going, this team, has something special in the backcourt. And I think you could really, now consider Clark Slajchert part of that group if he can keep these things going. Of course, Desmond Claude, USC fans want him back. Of course, he's a dynamic player. He's a leading scorer on this team. But USC might have unlocked something with Clark Slajchert that they didn't know they had. And if he can come off the bench and supplement, when Desmond Claude or other guards want to sit, I think that is something that they could work with. Wesley Yates had 15 points. He's been sitting around that for the past few games, considering he's only a first-year player, not too bad. Had 7 free throw makes on 8 attempts. Chibuzo Abo, the third leading scorer with 14 points. He still hasn't really unlocked much from distance, but I do appreciate him getting inside, creating more chances for himself, especially considering his length. USC's bench looked a little bit different today. Matt Noling back and healthy, 32 minutes played. Josh Cohen only checked in for 3 minutes, so his role has really changed. Kevin Patton got in for 11 and had a good look at the end of the first half to just make it a 2-point game by the time the first half buzzer sounded. But the two teams were really neck and neck in that second half, although, of course, Northwestern did pull away at certain points, led by 15. USC really got things going. Let's go to those final few sequences. So Chibuzo Abo makes a 3 and is fouled, has a chance for a 4-point play, and he misses the free throw. And, of course, we've talked about this. USC has struggled with free throws so much this year. That's been their weak spot in moments like this. Northwestern was able to go down the court and draw a foul. They missed their free throw, made another. USC has the ball down 75-71, and Clark Slajchert, who else, makes a 3 from near the logo, and he's fouled on the play. So USC has a chance for a 4-point play after missing the 4-point play on the previous possession, and Slajchert makes the free throw, so it's tied up at 75. And Northwestern, with under half a minute remaining, is able to go down the court, waste some time, and Nick Martinelli makes a shot from inside, and that would pretty much do it, 77-75. Martinelli, of course, a great player. We mentioned he's so versatile and so dynamic. I want to talk about St. Thomas as well. I feel like his role has changed, of course, as well. I mean, he's kind of an interesting player because, we thought going into the season, given what he was able to do at Northern Colorado, that he was going to be that surefire scorer. And it's not like he hasn't scored a lot this year. He's had games where he scored, over 20 points against UCLA, had double digits, and a stretch going back further had double digits. The past 2 games, though, he's sort of taken a back seat, but has been good at passing and good at rebounding. So that's something to look at. Maybe his minutes change. He played the full 40, but USC's forward depth is obviously pretty depleted. So, of course, that's something that they can't really control, especially with Terrence Williams being injured. And so that's something that's kind of interesting. St. Thomas, he's very versatile. Maybe it hurts him sometimes when USC needs that scoring. But the reality is, if Clark Slajchert doesn't have the game he has, this game is nowhere close. Desmond Claude, if he plays, it's maybe a different story. But Clark Slajchert slots in nicely. Played 30 minutes, scored the most points on this team. And we knew when, USC recruited him that he was going to be a pure scoring guy. Of course, he wasn't a top prospect. Obviously, he was playing at Penn and put up some really good numbers there, coming off his best season with 18 points per game. But a great game for him. Kevin Patton Jr., I think, is a guy we should look at as well. He had 3 blocks off the bench and, obviously a guy who's mostly been a depth guy for USC, but good to see him step in as well. But I don't want to just talk about the positives because, of course, the Trojans did lose this game. And it really came down to what we saw against UCLA. It's not being able to play those clutch minutes with a cerebral game plan. And of course, missing free throws, whatnot, that's unlucky. But of course, USC could not close out on defense. And Martinelli's a player that, you have to keep an eye on and really guard closely on final possession like that. And it's not like they weren't playing good defense, but of course Martinelli was able to scoop in that lane and, obviously there were Trojans in the area, but he put that shot up and, didn't even use the glass, was just in and put it through. So that was a big issue. I think also, of course, circling back to the rebounds, I think if USC, can just make it a little bit closer. I mean, the rebound margin was -16. I think, they make it a lot closer. But I do commend USC for keeping the turnovers in the single digits and really unlocking that three-point ability. Of course, we've seen more recently, USC has shot a lot better from beyond the arc. It's been a rough patch for him this season and being able to consistently find looks from there, especially with Chibuzo Abo not necessarily having that three-point stroke we thought he'd have. But Clark Slajchert, props to him. I mean, we just didn't see that coming. I didn't see that coming. And I mean, he shot 82% from the field, had a season high, and so that's something to be proud of. Rashawn Agee, a storyline returning to his hometown of Chicago. He grew up a little bit away from Northwestern, but he came in, didn't have really the game that that you need out of a starting center, and that's been an issue for USC all year. It's like you're going to get scoring from AG occasionally. He had 7 points, but the rebounding just wasn't there, and they relied a lot on St. Thomas for that. But he's not the center, and AG only had 4 rebounds. Cohen dealt with the same issue, but obviously, it's tough for USC in a situation where you're usually getting outplayed down low. So that's something that USC has had to deal with all season, and I don't think it's going to change necessarily because obviously this roster is constructed the way it is. But I think looking big picture, when you beat the number 7 team in the country, you go on the road, you're playing against a Northwestern team that really hasn't been playing their best brand of basketball lately, not to mention one of their top scorers going down with injury. I think this is a game you have to win. And so I think that's very disappointing. I'm sure Eric Musselman's disappointed, going on the road, handling that adversity. And of course, you can make the same argument that Desmond Claude, of course, didn't play. That's USC's best player. But Clark Slajchert filled in. And the reality is, if Desmond Claude played this game and started, Clark Slajchert's probably not getting many minutes. And to see the efficiency that Slajchert had, which, if we're being real here, was a lot more efficient than Desmond Claude's games, I think that's a very interesting thing, considering that Slajchert was very much so a replacement of Claude and actually could do more shooting from beyond the arc, something that Claude hasn't really explored much this season. So looking a little bit ahead, USC is going to play Purdue to round off the road trip. Purdue now is the number 1 team in the Big Ten. They're ranked number 7 in the country. And Michigan State, of course, lost to UCLA last night. So Purdue has that 10-2 conference record, 18-5 overall. From my own research on the Boilermakers, obviously they're one of the best three-point shooting teams in the conference. They shoot almost 40% from long range, and they're a very good shooting team in general, very efficient. They're the 10th best shooting team in the country. Not much of a bench, though. They're actually 14th in the Big Ten in bench scoring, which I think is an interesting thing that USC might be able to exploit, considering that, of course, USC struggles with depth issues, but if Slajchert, Noling, Kevin Patton can come in and just get their jobs done, like we saw against Northwestern, obviously Clark Slajchert started, but Desmond Claude comes back in this game, they'll have maybe a little bit more room to change around the lineup and whatnot. So USC fans will be praying for Desmond Claude to return. We have no word on that yet officially, but for Slajchert, a guy, I just can't harp on this enough, a guy who was averaging under 4 points per game, doing, what he was able to do against Northwestern, that is a little victory for USC. But of course, you want to win a game like that. And, it's just very hard to go on the road without your best scorer and deal with that sort of environment. So it's tough for USC. They dropped to 13-9 overall, 5-6 in conference play. Of course, Northwestern, similar in the overall record, but they're 4-8 in conference play. So, USC has had a better feat in the Big Ten. And we know earlier in the season, Eric Musselman said that he didn't know how many games USC was going to win in the Big Ten, and they've been able to sit around 500 for most of the season. And so, of course, they're exceeding expectations, but still disappointing. I mean, you look at this game and you look at the UCLA game, 2 games they easily could have won if they played their cards right down the stretch, and they just didn't. And so Eric Musselman said it himself. They knew that when Desmond wasn't playing, they had to search for that depth, search for other guys to get looks, and they just didn't rebound. And that's something that they've struggled with. Rebounding woes hurt them. That's probably why they lose this game. I'm sure if they rebound better, it's a different story, but should have, could have, would have. You never know what's going to happen in a game like this. But number 7 Purdue is going to be tough for USC. It's probably their toughest remaining matchup on the season. The only other ranked team USC will play before the Big Ten tournament, should they make it, is Maryland. And so USC will come home after the Purdue game for a 2-game set against Penn State, Minnesota, then go on another road trip, starting with that Maryland game. And Maryland's ranked at number 18 right now. USC's been able to beat ranked teams this year, so can't count anything out. But we will see how USC responds in West Lafayette, Indiana, against Purdue. It should be a good game. I mean, of course, USC, last time they played the number 7 team in the country, which was last game against Michigan State, they beat them. So beating Purdue is not impossible. They're the best team in the Big Ten for a reason. And of course, they have really that 3-headed monster that it's scary to play of Trey Kaufman-Renn, Braden Smith, and Fletcher Lawyer. And of course, Trey Kaufman-Renn has been, dynamic this season. He can rebound, he can score. And so Purdue is a very good 3-point shooting team. Those 3 guys can let it fly from beyond the arc if they want to. And so we'll see what happens with USC and their 3-point attack. It's looked better. But that's going to do it for this episode of Guardians of Galen. Trojans fall narrowly by 2 points to the Northwestern Wildcats. A heartbreaking loss for USC. Final score 77-75. Great game for Clark Slajchert, and we'll see how they respond going forward. As always, I'm your host, Casey Kasliner. Thank you for tuning in, and have a good one.